In a gripping tale of prejudice and resilience, homeless black man harassed by cops, turns out he's a war hero, follows Isaiah Thompson, a decorated veteran grappling with systemic racism. Once celebrated for his bravery on the battlefield, Isaiah now faces hostility from those sworn to protect him. His daily struggle reveals a chilling truth. Even medals earned in service cannot shield him from societal biases. When confronted by officers who see only his homelessness and skin color, Isaiah's quiet dignity shines through, challenging stereotypes and forcing others to confront their own prejudices. This powerful narrative dives deep into themes of injustice, resilience, and the enduring fight for recognition in a system stacked against marginalized voices. As tensions rise, viewers are left questioning how far society has truly come in honoring its heroes. Will Isaiah's story awaken hearts or harden divides? Discover this unforgettable journey that demands reflection and action. Let's start. The sun rose over Fort Hood, casting long shadows across the training grounds where Lieutenant Isaiah Thompson stood at attention. His medals caught the light, glinting like tiny flames against the dull green of his uniform. To anyone watching, he was the picture of discipline and strength, a leader among soldiers. But beneath the surface, Isaiah carried a weight that no medal could lighten. He had earned respect for his leadership skills, but being one of the few black officers in his division meant navigating an invisible barrier of prejudice that never seemed to fade. Isaiah often felt it in small ways. The slight hesitation when he gave orders, the jokes whispered just loud enough for him to hear, or the way some peers avoided meeting his eyes during briefings. It wasn't always overt, but it was there. A constant reminder that his presence made others uncomfortable. As he marched alongside his unit, these thoughts crept into his mind, uninvited yet impossible to ignore. Later that evening, Isaiah sat alone in his quarters, staring at an old photograph of his grandfather. The man in the picture wore a uniform too, though it bore the marks of a different era. A Korean War veteran, his grandfather had faced segregation within the military, forced to eat separately, sleep separately, and fight for recognition even after serving his country. Isaiah remembered the stories vividly, tales of resilience and quiet defiance. "You have to keep pushing," his grandfather would say. "Change doesn't come easy, but if we don't push, who will?" Those words echoed in Isaiah's mind now, fueling his determination to break cycles of injustice despite knowing the personal cost it might bring. The next day, tension crackled through the air during a high-stakes training simulation debrief. Private Ryan Dawson leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, as he casually dropped racial slurs while criticizing another soldier's performance. The room fell silent except for the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Isaiah stepped forward, his voice steady but firm. "That kind of language has no place here," he said, locking eyes with Dawson. Dawson smirked, brushing off the comment with a laugh. "Relax, sir. It's just locker room talk." Around them, other soldiers shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact. No one spoke up in support of Isaiah. Instead, they remained silent, letting the moment hang heavy in the air like smoke. Frustration simmered inside Isaiah, but he held his ground, refusing to let the remark slide. Afterward, Isaiah reported the incident to Colonel Mark Hargrove, hoping for accountability. Sitting behind his desk, Hargrove listened without expression, his fingers steepled under his chin. When Isaiah finished speaking, the colonel sighed deeply, leaning back in his chair. "Look, Lieutenant," he began, his tone dismissive. "I understand your concerns, but stirring this pot isn't going to help morale. Let's focus on what matters, the mission." As Isaiah left the office, the weight of those words settled heavily on his shoulders. This wasn't just about Dawson. It was about years of systemic bias being swept under the rug again and again. Each step back to his quarters felt heavier than the last, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. Over the following weeks, the fallout became undeniable. Fellow soldiers began avoiding Isaiah, their once friendly nods replaced by cold indifference. Whispers spread through the ranks, painting him as divisive rather than courageous. Some claimed he was exaggerating the incident, while others suggested he fabricated it entirely. Rumors swirled like wildfire, leaving Isaiah more isolated than ever before. Superiors retaliated subtly, assigning him menial tasks far removed from the critical operations he once led. Cleaning supply closets, filing paperwork, and overseeing routine drills replaced the meaningful missions that had defined his career. Each assignment chipped away at his confidence and sense of purpose. Alone in his quarters one night, Isaiah stared at the ceiling, wrestling with self-doubt. Was standing up worth it? Would fighting for justice truly make a difference? Or would it only isolate him further? But then, memories of his grandfather surfaced again, grounding him. Isaiah thought of the resilience his grandfather had shown, enduring hardships Isaiah could scarcely imagine. Slowly, resolve sparked within him. No matter how much pressure mounted, no matter how many lies circulated, Isaiah knew he couldn't let fear dictate his actions. Determined not to give up, he resolved to continue seeking accountability, no matter the cost. The mess hall buzzed with the usual clatter of trays and murmured conversations, but as Isaiah stepped inside, the noise seemed to evaporate. Soldiers who once greeted him warmly now averted their eyes, pretending not to notice his presence. The lively chatter that used to fill the room had been replaced by an uncomfortable silence, broken only by the occasional whisper or nervous glance in his direction. Isaiah moved through the space like a shadow, unnoticed yet impossible to ignore. He slid into an empty seat at the far corner of the room, gripping his tray tightly as he stared at the untouched food before him. For the first time in years, he felt truly alone. On the training field, things were no better. Subordinates hesitated when Isaiah gave orders, exchanging uncertain glances before reluctantly following through, or worse, ignoring them altogether. One morning, he instructed a group of soldiers to adjust their formation during a drill, but they stood frozen, unsure whether to obey. "Sir," one finally muttered under his breath, "maybe we should wait for confirmation from Captain Lewis." Isaiah clenched his jaw, forcing himself to remain composed. Each ignored directive chipped away at his authority, deepening the sense of betrayal gnawing at him. At home, sleep eluded him. Isaiah lay awake in the dim glow of his bedside lamp, staring at the ceiling as memories of combat flooded his mind. Explosions echoed in his ears, mingling with the sting of institutional abandonment. His chest tightened as he replayed moments from recent weeks, the dismissive laughter, the cold indifference of Colonel Hargrove, the growing distance between him and those he once called comrades. He tossed and turned, unable to escape the painful truth. The system he had sworn to protect no longer protected him. Late one night, unable to bear the confines of his quarters, Isaiah wandered through the base's deserted corridors. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above him, casting long shadows on the walls. Every step felt heavier than the last, as though the weight of isolation pressed down on his shoulders. He passed rows of closed doors, each one a reminder of friendships lost and loyalties fractured. The emptiness around him mirrored the void within, amplifying his despair. For the first time, he allowed himself to acknowledge just how lonely this fight had become. Meanwhile, fear began spreading among his colleagues. Those who had initially expressed sympathy for Isaiah's plight started distancing themselves after receiving subtle warnings from higher-ups. Conversations became guarded, and support dwindled. In the break room, Sergeant Marcus Hale approached Isaiah cautiously, pulling him aside. "Look, man," Marcus said, his voice low and tense. "I believe you're doing the right thing, but if I keep backing you, it could cost us both our careers. You understand, don't you?" Isaiah nodded stiffly, though Marcus's words cut deeper than any insult ever could. It wasn't just Dawson or Hargrove, it was the entire institution, built on foundations that rewarded silence over justice. Frustrated and heartbroken, Isaiah sat alone in his office later that day, staring blankly at the stack of reports on his desk. The pieces were falling into place, revealing a harsh reality he couldn't unsee. Racism wasn't just an individual act. It was a pervasive force woven into every layer of command. From promotions denied without explanation to disciplinary actions disproportionately targeting minority personnel, the evidence was undeniable. Yet, acknowledging it meant confronting a truth too many were unwilling to face. One by one, Isaiah watched as colleagues retreated into self-preservation, leaving him standing alone against an institution unwilling to acknowledge its flaws. Captain Lewis avoided eye contact during briefings, while Lieutenant Carter outright dismissed Isaiah's concerns about ongoing discriminatory practices. Even Private Thompson, who had once admired Isaiah's leadership, now hesitated to engage beyond curt nods. Each withdrawal felt like another blow, isolating him further. But amidst the loneliness, something stirred within Isaiah, a quiet resolve. If no one else would stand with him, then he would stand alone, carrying the torch of justice until someone else dared to join him. The small dining room in Isaiah's childhood home smelled of fried chicken and collard greens, a comforting aroma that seemed to wrap itself around the weighty stories being told. Isaiah sat at the table, his grandfather's voice filling the space as he recounted tales of segregation and discrimination during the Korean War. "They put us in separate barracks," his grandfather said, leaning forward, his hands clasped tightly on the table. "We fought just as hard, bled just as much, but when it came time for recognition, we were invisible." His words painted a vivid picture of systemic racism, a shadow that had lingered across generations, stretching from the past into the present. Later, Isaiah found himself alone in the living room, holding his grandfather's war medals in his hands. They were heavy, not just in their physical form but in what they represented: sacrifice, resilience, and pride. Yet, alongside the pride was an undeniable pain, the kind that came from knowing your contributions were undervalued simply because of the color of your skin. Isaiah traced the edges of the medals with his fingers, imagining the scars his grandfather carried, both visible and invisible. He felt a deep respect for the man who had endured so much, yet never stopped fighting for dignity and justice. Years later, as a teenager, Isaiah stood in front of his family one evening, announcing his decision to join the military. "I'm not running away from injustice," he said firmly, meeting their eyes. "I'm stepping into it head-on. If I can make even a small difference, then it'll be worth it." His mother sighed, worry etched into her features. "Isaiah, you know how hard it is out there," she said softly. "People don't always see you for who you are. They only see what they want to see." His father nodded slowly, pride mingling with concern. "Just promise us you'll stay strong," he said. "No matter what happens, don't let them break you." As Isaiah grew older, he began noticing patterns, echoes of the stories his grandfather had told him. During basic training, he saw how some instructors treated minority recruits differently, assigning them extra duties or scrutinizing their every move. At first, he tried to brush it off, telling himself it was all part of the process. But over time, the parallels became impossible to ignore. The same biases that had haunted his grandfather decades ago still lingered, lurking beneath the surface of policies and practices designed to maintain the status quo. Late one night, Isaiah sat hunched over his desk, the dim glow of his lamp casting long shadows across stacks of declassified documents. Each page revealed new layers of systemic inequity, confirming suspicions he'd harbored for years. He read about promotions denied without explanation, soldiers overlooked despite exemplary performance reviews. One file detailed how a black sergeant with glowing recommendations was passed over 3 times for advancement while less qualified white officers moved up the ranks effortlessly. Isaiah clenched his fists, frustration bubbling inside him. These weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a pattern, a deliberate system designed to keep certain groups in place. Further digging uncovered records of disciplinary actions, starkly illustrating the imbalance in accountability measures. For similar infractions, black soldiers received harsher penalties than their white counterparts. A minor infraction like being late to formation might result in a formal reprimand for one group while earning nothing more than a verbal warning for another. The disparity was glaring, undeniable proof of bias woven into the very fabric of the institution. Isaiah felt a chill run down his spine as he realized how deeply entrenched these practices were, and how many lives they had impacted. Armed with this knowledge, Isaiah began connecting dots between the injustices of the past and the challenges he faced today. The stories his grandfather had shared no longer felt distant. They were threads in the same tapestry, binding history to the present. He thought about the soldiers he served alongside, the ones who worked tirelessly, only to be overlooked or unfairly punished. Their struggles mirrored those of his grandfather, proving that while uniforms may have changed, the underlying issues remained the same. This realization solidified his resolve. If no one else would expose these systemic barriers, then he would. And if dismantling them meant standing alone, so be it. Isaiah sat across the table from Elena Morales, her sharp eyes locked onto his, as he recounted the events that had brought him here. The small cafe buzzed with quiet chatter around them, but Isaiah felt like they were in their own world. For weeks, he'd carried the weight of isolation and doubt alone, unsure if anyone would truly understand or care. But as Elena listened intently, nodding at key moments and occasionally jotting notes, a flicker of hope ignited within him for the first time in what felt like forever. Later that evening, Isaiah and Elena huddled over documents spread across a cluttered desk in her office. The air smelled faintly of coffee and worn paper, the only sounds coming from the occasional rustle of pages and the hum of a distant printer. "We need to be strategic," Elena said firmly, tapping one of the files. "If we push too hard too fast, it could backfire. Not just for you, but for everyone involved." Isaiah nodded, though his brow furrowed with concern. "What's our first step?" he asked. Together, they mapped out a plan, gathering evidence, building alliances, and finding ways to expose systemic racism without jeopardizing Isaiah's standing in the military. Each decision revealed both risks and opportunities ahead, leaving Isaiah acutely aware of how high the stakes were. The next day, Elena introduced Isaiah to members of an advocacy group dedicated to racial justice. They gathered in a modest community center, its walls lined with posters advocating equality and reform. As Isaiah shared his story, he saw nods of understanding and determination in their eyes. For the first time, he realized he wasn't fighting this battle alone. There were people outside the military ready to stand beside him. One woman, a veteran herself, clasped his hand after the meeting. "You're not just speaking for yourself," she said softly. "You're speaking for all of us." Despite the newfound support, doubts crept into Isaiah's mind late at night when the house was silent except for the ticking clock on the wall. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wrestling with uncertainty. Could they really win against such a powerful institution? What if everything they did amounted to nothing more than whispers drowned out by bureaucracy? His vulnerability gnawed at him, underscoring the enormity of the fight ahead. Yet even in those moments of doubt, something inside him refused to give up, a stubborn spark of resilience that kept him moving forward. Back at the base, Isaiah began reaching out cautiously to junior officers who shared his frustrations but feared retaliation. Late one evening, he met Private Daniels in a secluded corner of the barracks, where shadows muted their voices. "I know how it feels," Isaiah said quietly, leaning closer. "Like no matter what you do, the system doesn't see you." Daniels hesitated before nodding slowly. "It's not just me," he admitted. "A lot of us feel the same way." These whispered conversations became lifelines, forging tentative bonds among soldiers who had long suffered in silence. One by one, soldiers agreed to contribute anonymous testimonies detailing their experiences with discrimination. In a dimly lit room off base, Isaiah worked alongside Elena and a few trusted allies to compile these accounts into a cohesive narrative. Each story added weight to their case, painting a damning picture of systemic inequity. As Isaiah read through the testimonies, he felt a surge of gratitude and responsibility. These voices weren't just supporting his cause. They were laying the foundation for something much larger than any one person. As more individuals stepped forward, Isaiah found himself surrounded by a growing coalition united by shared struggles. Late-night meetings became strategy sessions, filled with heated debates and cautious optimism. "We're stronger together," Isaiah reminded the group during one particularly tense discussion. "This isn't about me or you. It's about changing the system for everyone." Their collective resolve strengthened with each passing day, transforming fear into courage and uncertainty into purpose. Though the fear of retribution lingered like a shadow, the group drew strength from solidarity. During one meeting, Sergeant Harris spoke up, his voice trembling but resolute. "I've been scared my whole career to say anything," he confessed. "But knowing I'm not alone, it makes it easier." Others nodded in agreement, sharing similar sentiments. Each member took solace in the knowledge that they were part of something bigger than themselves, a movement toward justice that transcended individual fears. And while the road ahead remained uncertain, they faced it together, bolstered by the unshakable belief that change was possible. Isaiah and Elena sat in a small, dimly lit conference room, the air thick with tension as they listened to one service member after another recount their experiences. A former sergeant named Marcus leaned forward, his voice trembling as he described being passed over for promotions despite stellar performance reviews. "It wasn't just me," he said, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "They made it clear, no matter how good you were, your name didn't matter if your skin color did." Each testimony added weight to their growing dossier, fueling Isaiah's determination to expose the truth. As more stories poured in, the magnitude of the injustice became impossible to ignore. Back at Elena's office, Isaiah spread out the collected testimonies across a large wooden table. He stared at them, connecting dots that had long been hidden beneath layers of bureaucracy. Patterns emerged, unequal evaluations that consistently favored white soldiers, promotions denied without explanation, and disciplinary actions disproportionately targeting minorities. The evidence painted a chilling picture. This wasn't random or isolated. It was systemic. Isaiah felt anger rise in his chest, but also clarity. These weren't individual failures. It was an institutional web of bias designed to maintain the status quo. Late into the night, Isaiah sat alone under flickering fluorescent lights, surrounded by stacks of classified memos and policy papers. His fingers traced lines of text, piecing together decades of neglect toward racial equity. One memo outlined a directive to maintain cohesion by avoiding diversity initiatives, a thinly veiled euphemism for exclusion. Another document revealed deliberate efforts to bury complaints of discrimination. With each discovery, Isaiah's resolve hardened. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every soldier who had ever been silenced, overlooked, or pushed aside because of who they were. As dawn broke through the blinds, Isaiah sat back in his chair, exhaustion etched on his face but fire burning in his eyes. Every revelation fueled a deeper sense of purpose. This fight wasn't personal, it was universal. It was for the young recruit told he'd never make officer rank, for the veteran haunted by years of unfair treatment, for everyone who had suffered in silence. Isaiah clenched his fists, feeling the weight of the mission pressing down on him, but also the power it gave him. Justice wasn't just a dream, it was a necessity. The breaking news hit like a thunderclap. Key excerpts from the dossier appeared on a national news outlet, sparking outrage across the country. Headlines screamed accusations of systemic racism within the military, forcing Americans to confront uncomfortable truths. Television anchors spoke gravely about the allegations, while social media erupted with reactions. Hashtags like #MilitaryJusticeNow trended within hours, amplifying voices demanding accountability. For many, this was the first time they truly considered the scope of racial inequity within the armed forces, a reckoning that couldn't be ignored. Outside military bases nationwide, crowds gathered, holding signs that read, "Transparency Now," and chanting slogans like, "No justice, no peace." The energy was electric, a mix of anger and hope driving protesters forward. Some carried photos of loved ones who had served, sharing stories of discrimination they'd faced. Others simply stood in solidarity, refusing to let the issue fade into obscurity. But beneath the surface, tensions simmered. Counter-protesters argued that the military's integrity was being unfairly attacked, creating a volatile atmosphere where emotions ran high. Social media became a battleground of its own. While some rallied behind Isaiah's cause, posting heartfelt messages of support, others defended the military's honor, dismissing claims of widespread bias as exaggerations. Comment sections turned into heated debates, highlighting deep divides in society. If he wanted equality, why'd he join the military? One user sneered. Another shot back, because patriots don't run from injustice, they fight it. The clash of opinions underscored just how polarizing the issue was, revealing fault lines that stretched far beyond the confines of the armed forces. Television screens lit up living rooms nationwide as reporters delved deeper into the scandal. Anchors interviewed experts, veterans, and activists, shedding light on systemic issues that had long been swept under the rug. For many viewers, this marked the first time they truly understood the extent of racial inequity within the military. Parents watched with furrowed brows, explaining the protests to curious children. College students shared clips online, sparking discussions in classrooms and dorms. The nation held its breath, waiting to see whether this moment would lead to real change, or simply fade away like so many others before it. Isaiah stood at the podium, his hands gripping its edges as cameras flashed and lawmakers leaned forward in anticipation. The weight of the nation's gaze pressed heavily on his shoulders, but he refused to let it show. Flanked by Elena and a small group of advocates, he took a deep breath, steadying himself for what lay ahead. This was more than just a hearing, it was a reckoning. Across the room, reporters scribbled notes furiously, while television screens broadcast his every move to millions. For Isaiah, there was no turning back now. With unwavering resolve, Isaiah began to speak, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. I stand before you today not just as an officer, but as one of many who have been failed by the very institution we swore to protect. He said, his words cutting through the chamber like a blade. He recounted harrowing experiences, racial slurs dismissed as locker room talk, promotions denied without explanation, disciplinary actions that targeted minorities unfairly. Each story painted a vivid picture of systemic injustice, leaving listeners visibly moved. Lawmakers exchanged uneasy glances, their expressions shifting between disbelief and discomfort. Elena stepped forward next, her presence commanding yet composed. She held up documents filled with damning evidence, testimonies from service members, classified memos detailing discriminatory policies, and statistical analyses revealing decades of inequity. These aren't isolated incidents, she declared, her voice ringing out clearly. This is a pattern, a deliberate effort to maintain a system built on bias. Each piece of evidence landed like a thunderclap, underscoring the depth of institutional corruption. Gasps rippled through the audience as the full scope of the scandal came into focus. As Isaiah concluded his speech, an eerie silence blanketed the chamber. The kind of silence that comes when truth is laid bare, undeniable and unrelenting. Lawmakers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, avoiding eye contact with each other or the witnesses. Viewers nationwide held their breath, struck by the undeniable reality unfolding before them. It wasn't just Isaiah's story. It was a mirror reflecting societal failures too long ignored. Midway through questioning, the doors at the back of the chamber opened, drawing everyone's attention. A figure cloaked in anonymity entered, clutching a folder of classified documents. Tension crackled in the air as all eyes turned to this mysterious ally. Whispers spread among attendees. Who was this person? What did they know? The whistleblower approached the front, handing over the files to the committee chair. Their identity remained hidden, but their actions spoke volumes. The whistleblower unveiled explosive evidence, documents exposing deliberate cover-ups, biased evaluations, and discriminatory policies embedded within the military hierarchy. As each revelation spilled forth, gasps rippled through the audience. Reporters scrambled to capture every detail, their pens flying across notebooks. The sheer magnitude of the scandal left even seasoned politicians stunned. For Isaiah, it felt like vindication, the proof he'd fought so hard to uncover finally seeing the light of day. News outlets immediately broadcast the whistleblower's revelations, tipping public sentiment overwhelmingly in favor of reform. Social media erupted with hashtags demanding accountability, while protests outside military bases grew larger and louder. Military leaders scrambled to contain the fallout, issuing vague statements about addressing concerns, while privately panicking over the avalanche of evidence against them. Calls for transparency and justice echoed across the nation, marking a decisive shift in public opinion. Military officials sat stunned, unable to counter the avalanche of proof arrayed against them. Their attempts to deflect responsibility faltered under the weight of irrefutable evidence. One general stammered through a weak defense, only to be met with sharp questions from lawmakers who had once defended the institution blindly. Another official buried his face in his hands, realizing the tide had turned irreversibly. For Isaiah and those fighting alongside him, it was a turning point, a moment where denial gave way to acknowledgement and silence surrendered to demands for change. In the days following Isaiah's testimony, lawmakers acted swiftly, their voices echoing through the halls of Congress as they announced an official investigation into systemic racism within the military. The decision sent shockwaves through the institution, signaling a turning point in the fight for justice. Reporters crowded outside the Capitol, shouting questions at legislators who emerged with solemn expressions. For many, this moment marked the first time the nation had collectively acknowledged the deep-rooted inequities plaguing one of its most revered institutions. For the first time in decades, top military officials stood before cameras and issued a public apology. "We have failed to live up to our ideals," admitted General Harris, his tone heavy with regret. "The inequities that have persisted within our ranks are unacceptable, and we pledge to address them head-on." His words carried weight, but skepticism lingered in the eyes of those watching. Observers demanded more than rhetoric, they wanted action. Social media buzzed with reactions, some hopeful, others cynical. "Apologies mean nothing without change," one veteran tweeted, capturing the sentiment of millions. Isaiah became a household name almost overnight. News outlets hailed him as a beacon of resilience and determination, his face appearing on magazine covers and television screens nationwide. Marginalized communities saw themselves reflected in his journey. His courage inspired not just admiration but action. Parents told their children about him, teachers discussed his story in classrooms, and activists rallied around his cause. He wasn't just a symbol of resistance. He was proof that standing up could spark real change. Alone in his quarters late one evening, Isaiah allowed himself a rare moment of peace. Sitting on the edge of his bed, he stared at the wall, replaying the whirlwind of events in his mind. It felt surreal, the hearings, the revelations, the apologies, all culminating in a vindication he had once doubted was possible. But even amidst the triumph, he knew the road ahead remained long. Still, for now, he let himself savor this hard-earned victory, however fleeting it might be. Under mounting pressure from both the public and lawmakers, the Department of Defense unveiled sweeping reforms aimed at dismantling discriminatory practices. Diversity training programs were mandated across all branches, while transparent promotion processes replaced opaque systems prone to bias. These measures signaled a bold step toward inclusivity, though skeptics warned they were only the beginning. "This is progress," Elena said during a press conference, her voice firm yet hopeful. "But we must remain vigilant." New oversight committees were established, marking a seismic shift in institutional governance. For the first time, external voices held the military accountable, ensuring compliance with anti-discrimination policies. Civilian leaders joined military officials in these efforts, creating a bridge between communities and the armed forces. At a ceremony announcing the changes, Isaiah watched quietly from the sidelines, his heart swelling with cautious optimism. Accountability was no longer an afterthought, it was central to reform. Training programs rolled out across bases nationwide, teaching soldiers about racial equity and allyship. Instructors led workshops where participants shared personal stories, fostering empathy and understanding. Slowly but surely, attitudes began to shift. Leaders emphasized unity over division, encouraging open dialogue about biases and stereotypes. On one base, a young recruit approached Isaiah after a session. "Thank you," she said softly. "I didn't think anyone cared until now." Her gratitude reminded him why this fight mattered so deeply. As reforms took root, Isaiah joined community leaders in envisioning a brighter future, a military where no soldier had to endure the injustices he faced. They gathered in a modest conference room, brainstorming ways to sustain momentum and hold institutions accountable. It's not perfection, Isaiah admitted during the meeting, his voice steady. But it's progress, and that's enough for now. For the first time in years, hope outweighed doubt. The seeds of inclusion had been planted, and though the harvest was still far off, Isaiah believed it would come, one step, one voice, one life at a time. Isaiah sat alone in his quarters, the faint hum of the overhead light filling the silence. His fingers traced the edge of a worn photograph on his desk, his family smiling back at him, unaware of the weight pressing down on his shoulders. He thought about the battles he'd fought, the victories won, and the setbacks that still loomed ahead. Progress had been made, but it felt fragile, like sand slipping through his fingers. True change wouldn't come overnight. It would take generations to dismantle the deeply entrenched systems of bias he'd spent years confronting. The realization was both sobering and motivating, a reminder that this fight wasn't just for today, it was for tomorrow. As Isaiah gazed at the photo longer, his thoughts turned to his children. Their laughter echoed in his mind, a sound so pure it seemed impossible they could ever face the same injustices he had endured. But he knew better than to assume the world would fix itself. If anything, his journey had taught him that progress required relentless effort. He made a silent vow then and there to leave behind a legacy that extended beyond his own life. A world where his kids could walk into any room without feeling the sting of prejudice, where their worth wouldn't be questioned because of the color of their skin. It was a dream worth fighting for, no matter how distant it seemed. Despite the public acclaim and newfound recognition, doubts lingered in Isaiah's mind. Late at night, when the noise of the day faded, he wrestled with questions he couldn't shake. Had his efforts truly shifted the system, or had they merely scratched its surface? Were the reforms being implemented enough to create lasting change, or were they just band-aids over deeper wounds? These internal struggles gnawed at him, underscoring the complexity of systemic reform. Yet even in these moments of uncertainty, something inside him refused to give up, a stubborn belief that every step forward mattered, no matter how small. With renewed determination, Isaiah rose from his chair one morning, resolve hardening in his chest. This wasn't just about him anymore, it never had been. It was about every soldier who came after him, every voice silenced by bias, every dream crushed under the weight of prejudice. He vowed to keep fighting, not out of obligation but out of love, for his family, his community, and the future he believed was possible. This promise became his guiding light, a beacon pulling him through moments of doubt and exhaustion. Isaiah found strength in partnership, aligning himself with grassroots organizations dedicated to racial equity. In cramped community centers and bustling conference rooms, he strategized with activists whose passion matched his own. Together, they mapped out ways to amplify marginalized voices across all sectors of society. "We're stronger together," said Elena during one meeting. Her words resonate deeply with everyone present. For Isaiah, these alliances weren't just practical. They were lifelines, reminding him he wasn't alone in this fight. Workshops became a cornerstone of their advocacy efforts, led by Isaiah and other leaders determined to educate through action. Soldiers, civilians, and leaders gathered in classrooms and auditoriums, engaging in difficult but necessary conversations about racial bias and allyship. One session stood out vividly in Isaiah's memory, a young recruit tearfully recounting how she'd been dismissed by superiors simply because of her race. Her vulnerability sparked raw honesty among participants, planting seeds of transformation that would grow far beyond those walls. Standing before crowds at rallies, Isaiah delivered impassioned speeches that ignited hope and anger in equal measure. "This isn't just my fight, it's ours," he declared, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. Protesters chanted slogans inspired by his journey: "No justice, no peace, and accountability now," their voices uniting in a groundswell of support for lasting reform. The energy was electric, a mix of frustration and determination driving people forward. As Isaiah looked out at the sea of faces, he saw not just individuals but a movement gaining momentum. Through educational campaigns, Isaiah and his allies brought attention to systemic racism, encouraging individuals to confront prejudice in their own lives and communities. Flyers plastered on bulletin boards, social media posts shared widely, and town hall meetings drew diverse audiences eager to learn and act. Their message resonated far beyond military walls, sparking discussions in schools, workplaces, and homes. For many, it was the first time they truly understood the scope of racial inequity, and the first time they felt empowered to do something about it. Isaiah watched as fires of awareness spread across communities, lighting paths toward justice that stretched farther than he'd ever imagined. The halls of Congress buzzed with urgency as lawmakers worked late into the night, drafting landmark legislation aimed at rooting out systemic racism within the military. Spurred by Isaiah's testimony and the national reckoning that followed, the bills gained unprecedented bipartisan support. Lawmakers spoke passionately on the floor, their voices rising above partisan divides. "This is not just a moment for change, it's a mandate," declared Senator Alvarez. Her words met with nods of agreement from colleagues who had once been reluctant to act. Public pressure mounted outside the Capitol, where protesters held signs demanding accountability, their chants echoing through the marble corridors. New laws mandated regular audits of military policies and practices, ensuring compliance with anti-discrimination measures. These reviews weren't optional. They were designed to hold leaders accountable and prevent future injustices. In committee hearings, experts testified about the importance of transparency, urging lawmakers to make these audits rigorous and unyielding. "Accountability isn't a suggestion, it's a requirement," said one advocate, his voice firm as he addressed skeptical officials. For Isaiah, watching from the gallery, this felt like a step toward justice, but only a step. He knew audits alone wouldn't erase decades of inequity, but they were a start. Lawmakers also allocated increased funding to programs promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion within the armed forces. Resources poured into training initiatives, grievance resolution systems, and community-building efforts. Military bases began hosting workshops led by external facilitators, teaching soldiers how to recognize bias and foster inclusivity. One evening, Isaiah attended a session where recruits shared personal stories of discrimination, their vulnerability sparking raw honesty among participants. It was clear that these investments were more than symbolic. They were seeds planted in fertile ground, waiting to grow. As the bills were signed into law, Isaiah stood quietly in the gallery, his heart heavy with cautious optimism. The room erupted in applause, cameras flashing as lawmakers posed with pens in hand. But Isaiah's mind drifted beyond the ceremony. He thought about the battles still ahead, the resistance that would inevitably arise, and the lives depending on these changes. Pride swelled in his chest, tempered by the knowledge that this victory wasn't an endpoint. It was a beginning. His fight was far from over. Advocacy groups wasted no time launching initiatives targeting schools and youth organizations, planting seeds of change early. They organized workshops teaching young people about racial equity, allyship, and the importance of standing against injustice. In gymnasiums and auditoriums across the country, students gathered to hear stories from activists who had fought similar battles. "You have power," Isaiah told a group of high schoolers during one session. "Use it wisely." Their wide eyes reflected curiosity and determination. These programs aimed to shape future leaders committed to fairness, ensuring Isaiah's legacy would endure long after he was gone. Classrooms became battlegrounds for justice as workshops and curricula focused on combating bias took root nationwide. Teachers guided discussions about systemic racism, encouraging students to challenge stereotypes and foster inclusivity. In one classroom, a debate erupted when a student argued that racism was a thing of the past. Another countered passionately, citing examples she'd learned about in recent lessons. The teacher stepped back, letting them navigate the conversation themselves. These moments, raw, honest, and sometimes uncomfortable, were proof that education could transform perspectives. Young activists inspired by Isaiah's story organized rallies and campaigns, breathing new life into the movement for racial justice. On college campuses and city streets, they demanded accountability and equality in their communities. One rally drew thousands, with speakers sharing personal experiences of discrimination and resilience. A teenage girl stood at the mic, her voice trembling but resolute. "We're done being silent," she declared, igniting cheers from the crowd. Isaiah watched from the sidelines, moved by their energy and conviction. This was what hope looked like, a generation unwilling to settle for less than justice. Through education and advocacy, these youth-focused programs laid the groundwork for a generation dedicated to dismantling prejudice. Isaiah saw glimpses of this legacy everywhere. In classrooms where students challenged outdated norms, in rallies where young voices demanded better, and in conversations that stretched far beyond military walls. At a community event, he met a boy no older than 10 who proudly showed him a drawing of diverse hands clasped together. "I want to help make things fair," the boy said earnestly. Isaiah smiled, feeling a surge of hope. His fight might never truly end, but it would live on in them. Isaiah found himself sitting across from Elena Morales once again, this time in a bustling cafe filled with the hum of conversation and the clink of coffee cups. Around them, activists, politicians, and community leaders exchanged ideas, their voices rising with passion. Isaiah had spent months building relationships with these individuals, each connection strengthening his resolve. They weren't just allies, they were lifelines, people who understood the weight of the fight and carried it alongside him. As Elena leaned forward, her eyes sharp but kind, she said, "You've done more than speak out, Isaiah. You've brought us together." He nodded, feeling a flicker of pride amidst the exhaustion. Late one night, Isaiah sat in a dimly lit conference room with a small group of collaborators. Papers were scattered across the table, marked with notes and highlighted passages. The air smelled faintly of stale coffee and determination. Voices rose and fell as they debated strategies, their words tinged with both frustration and hope. "We're stronger together," Isaiah said finally, breaking through the tension. His voice was calm but firm, a reminder that unity was their greatest weapon. These moments, raw and unfiltered, became a source of solace for him. He realized he wasn't alone anymore. He had a circle of support ready to stand by him no matter how hard the road became. Through collaboration, Isaiah began leveraging the platforms of influential figures to amplify his message. At a press conference, he stood beside a well-known politician as cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions. "Systemic racism isn't just a military issue, it's a societal one," Isaiah declared, his words echoing through the crowded room. The politician nodded in agreement, adding, "And we won't stop until every corner of our institutions reflects true equity." Together, they reached audiences Isaiah could never have touched on his own. Their combined efforts created ripples of change, spreading awareness far beyond what either could achieve alone. As trust deepened among his allies, Isaiah felt emboldened to take risks he might have hesitated over before. During a strategy meeting, one activist turned to him and said, "Your courage gives us permission to be brave too." Her words struck a chord, reminding Isaiah that progress wasn't built on solitary effort. It required collective action. These relationships weren't just professional. They were deeply personal, forged through shared struggles and mutual respect. With each new bond, Isaiah grew more confident in the power of unity, knowing that together, they could move mountains. Isaiah's courage inspired others to break their silence. In a quiet church basement, he facilitated a discussion group where survivors of discrimination shared their stories. One woman, her hands trembling as she spoke, recounted being passed over for promotions despite years of dedication. Another man described the humiliation of racial slurs whispered behind his back during training exercises. Isaiah listened intently, offering reassurance when voices faltered. "Your story matters," he told them. "And when we share it, we take away its power to silence us." One by one, individuals stepped forward, adding their experiences to the growing chorus demanding change. A young soldier named Marcus approached Isaiah after a rally, clutching a notebook filled with memories he'd kept hidden for years. "I want to help," he said, his voice shaking but determined. Stories poured in from all corners, some written, some spoken, all united by a common thread of pain and purpose. This network of survivors became a tapestry of resilience, woven together by shared goals and an unyielding desire for justice. Together, they proved there was strength in numbers. As more people came forward, their diverse backgrounds painted a vivid picture of systemic injustice. At a town hall meeting, a veteran shared how bias had followed him from deployment to civilian life, while a high school teacher described the subtle ways prejudice infiltrated classrooms. Their stories bridged divides, showing that racial injustice wasn't confined to one sector or experience. It was pervasive. Yet, rather than dividing them, these differences united them under a single banner: equity for all. Isaiah watched as strangers embraced after sharing their truths, forming bonds that transcended age, profession, and geography. What began as Isaiah's lonely battle transformed into a nationwide movement. Survivors who once felt isolated now found themselves part of something larger, a beacon of hope shining brightly against the darkness of prejudice. At a rally, Isaiah looked out at the sea of faces, each one carrying its own story of struggle and triumph. "This isn't my fight anymore," he said into the microphone, his voice steady. "It's ours." Cheers erupted, echoing his sentiment. For the first time, many in the crowd believed they truly weren't alone, and that belief gave them the strength to keep fighting. Communities across the country erupted into action, inspired by Isaiah's unwavering courage. Town halls filled to capacity as residents gathered to discuss systemic racism, their voices rising in unison against injustice. Marches spilled onto streets, banners held high with slogans like "Accountability starts here" and "Equity for all." Vigils lit up parks and squares, candles flickering in memory of those who had suffered silently for too long. The energy was electric, a mix of anger, hope, and determination driving people forward. It wasn't just Isaiah's fight anymore. It belonged to everyone. In a small community center on the outskirts of Chicago, local leaders hosted a town hall meeting that drew an unexpectedly large crowd. Residents packed into folding chairs, spilling into the aisles as they waited their turn at the microphone. A young mother stood first, her voice trembling but resolute. "My son came home crying last week because his teacher told him he'd never amount to anything," she said, clutching the mic tightly. Others followed, sharing stories of discrimination in schools, workplaces, and neighborhoods. These discussions weren't just cathartic, they sparked actionable plans. By the end of the night, attendees had formed committees focused on promoting inclusivity in hiring practices, school curricula, and housing policies. Mentorship programs began sprouting up nationwide, driven by communities eager to guide the next generation. In Detroit, Isaiah joined forces with a group of retired veterans to launch a program pairing marginalized youth with mentors who understood their struggles. One Saturday morning, Isaiah sat across from a teenager named Malik, listening intently as the boy described feeling invisible in his classes. "You're not alone," Isaiah reassured him, "and you don't have to figure this out by yourself." These mentorships aim to break cycles of prejudice, empowering young leaders to advocate for equity and justice within their own spheres. From grassroots organizers to everyday citizens, people stepped up to take ownership of the fight against racism. Neighbors organized cleanup drives in underserved areas, while parents worked with teachers to diversify classroom materials. Even small acts like challenging racist jokes or advocating for inclusive hiring practices became part of the collective effort. At a neighborhood potluck, Isaiah watched as conversations unfolded around tables laden with food. "Real change starts here," one woman said, gesturing to the diverse group gathered. "It starts with us." Their unity demonstrated that accountability wasn't reserved for institutions. It was everyone's responsibility. Informational campaigns swept through cities and towns, emphasizing the critical role allies played in combating discrimination. Posters plastered on bulletin boards read, "Be an ally. Speak up. Stand with us." Workshops taught participants how to recognize bias, not just overt acts of racism, but the subtle comments and microaggressions that often went unchecked. In one session, a facilitator held up a cartoon showing two employees receiving unequal treatment. "What do you see?" she asked. Hands shot up as attendees dissected the image, learning to spot inequities hidden in plain sight. Participants left equipped with tools to challenge stereotypes and dismantle prejudice systems within their workplaces and communities. Workshops also focused on training eyes to see injustice in daily life. Attendees learned to identify coded language in job postings, biased disciplinary actions in schools, and exclusionary practices in social settings. Role-playing exercises brought these lessons to life. In one scenario, a participant practiced addressing a coworker who consistently interrupted women during meetings. "That happens all the time," another attendee exclaimed afterward. "I didn't realize I could say something." These sessions empowered individuals to confront bias head-on, turning passive observers into active advocates. Training sessions honed in on turning bystanders into advocates, focusing on safe and effective intervention strategies. Participants role-played scenarios where they witnessed acts of bias, like overhearing a racial slur at a coffee shop or seeing someone being denied service based on appearance. Facilitators emphasized de-escalation techniques and the importance of assessing safety before stepping in. "Your voice matters," one trainer reminded the group. "Even saying, 'that's not okay,' can make a difference." Attendees left feeling more confident about intervening in real-world situations, ready to stand up when others couldn't. Campaigns stressed the importance of amplifying marginalized voices rather than speaking over them. Allies committed to listening without interrupting, learning without defensiveness, and standing alongside those leading the charge for justice. At a rally, Isaiah addressed a sea of faces holding signs that read, "Listen, learn, act." "This isn't about centering ourselves," he said firmly. "It's about building bridges of solidarity." His words resonated deeply, reminding everyone present that true allyship meant lifting others higher, even if it meant stepping back. Together, they vowed to keep pushing forward, united in purpose and resolve. Isaiah stepped onto the stage, the spotlight casting a warm glow over his figure as thunderous applause filled the auditorium. He paused for a moment, taking in the sea of faces before him, diverse, hopeful, and expectant. This was more than just another speech. It was the culmination of years of struggle, sacrifice, and resilience. As he began to speak, his voice resonated deeply, each word carrying the weight of experiences that had shaped not only his life, but also the lives of countless others. "Today," he started, his tone steady yet impassioned, "we celebrate progress, but we must never forget the battles fought to get here." In his speech, Isaiah took time to honor those who had stood by him through the darkest moments. His family, whose unwavering support had been his anchor. Allies like Elena Morales, who had fought alongside him with relentless determination. And fellow soldiers who had risked their careers to testify about systemic injustice. "No fight for justice is ever fought alone," he said, his eyes scanning the crowd. "It's the collective strength of those who refuse to stay silent that moves us forward." The audience nodded in agreement, many wiping away tears as they reflected on their own journeys. As Isaiah continued, he acknowledged how far society had come since he first stepped into the spotlight. Laws had changed, awareness had grown, and communities were uniting in ways once thought impossible. But he didn't shy away from emphasizing the work still ahead. "We've made strides, yes," he admitted, his voice firm. "But true equity requires vigilance. It demands that we keep pushing, even when the road feels endless." His words ignited a renewed sense of commitment among listeners, inspiring them to carry the torch of justice into the future. Toward the end of his address, Isaiah turned his focus to the next generation. "My journey doesn't end with me," he declared, his gaze steady and resolute. "It's up to all of you to take what we've learned and build upon it. Challenge stereotypes, dismantle barriers, and create a world where everyone can thrive." The room erupted in applause once again, but this time, it carried a different energy, a promise to continue the fight long after Isaiah's voice faded from the stage. To honor Isaiah's contributions, a foundation announced the launch of scholarships bearing his name during the conference's closing ceremony. These awards aimed to support marginalized youth pursuing careers in public service, symbolizing hope and opportunity for young leaders eager to make a difference. A video montage played on massive screens behind the podium, showcasing stories of students overcoming adversity and dreaming of brighter futures. When the clip ended, an official from the foundation approached the mic. "These scholarships are more than financial aid. They're investments in changemakers," she said, her voice ringing out clearly. The scholarships provided not only financial assistance, but also mentorship programs and access to resources designed to empower recipients. Students from underrepresented communities would now have the tools needed to break cycles of prejudice and shape the future of leadership across industries. At a reception following the announcement, Isaiah met some of the inaugural recipients. One young woman named Jasmine shared her dream of becoming a civil rights attorney. "Your story showed me I'm not alone," she told him, her eyes shining with gratitude. "And now, because of this scholarship, I know I can make a difference too." For the recipients, Isaiah's story became a guiding light. They vowed to use their education and platforms to dismantle systemic barriers and advocate for equality in all sectors of society. During a panel discussion featuring several scholars, one recipient named Marcus spoke passionately about his plans to reform policing practices in underserved neighborhoods. "Isaiah taught us that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's acting despite it," he said, drawing nods of approval from the audience. Another scholar, Maria, shared her goal of increasing representation in STEM fields. "If we don't see ourselves in these spaces, how will anyone else?" she asked rhetorically, earning enthusiastic applause. Through these scholarships, Isaiah's impact extended far beyond his lifetime. Each recipient became a living testament to his courage and determination, carrying forward his mission to create a fairer, more equitable world. At the close of the conference, Isaiah stood at the edge of the stage, watching as groups of scholars exchanged contact information and brainstormed ideas for collaboration. A smile tugged at the corners of his mouth as he realized the ripple effect of his efforts. Change wasn't linear or immediate, but it was inevitable, especially when fueled by young minds committed to justice. For Isaiah, this was enough. His legacy would endure not in monuments or statues, but in the actions of those inspired to carry the torch. As the final chapter of Isaiah's journey closed, the room fell silent for a moment, the weight of his words lingering in the air. Then, slowly, applause erupted, first a trickle, then a wave, filling the space with hope and determination. His story wasn't just his anymore. It belonged to everyone willing to listen, learn, and act. If Isaiah's courage inspired you, don't let the conversation end here. Like this moment of resilience, share it with others who need to hear it, and subscribe to the belief that change is possible when we stand together. After all, every voice matters, and yours could be the one that sparks the next ripple of justice. Let's keep building a world where no one has to fight alone.